Hey everyone, Stefan here. I'm back. I know it's been a while, but remember how I said last time I wanted to try out Blender Sculpting? Well, I did, and I actually liked it quite a lot, and I decided who better to try and sculpt for this exercise than the man we have to thank for the existence of this amazing piece of software. So this is my rendition of Roosendaal, Blender's benevolent dictator himself. I was actually shocked to find how few 3D portraits of him there were out there, so I felt I had to do something about it. Really, we owe this man and his team so much, it's insane. Anyway, I documented my whole experience working on this project and sculpting in Blender for the first time, so I invite you to join me in the next half hour or so in obsessing over how amazing and good looking this man is. Now, I'll be talking a little bit about what I'm doing specifically, but more so about my experience with this project. I'll still be showing pretty much the whole thing from start to finish, so I hope you'll stick around and enjoy it as much as I enjoyed making it. So I wanted to give this project the professional treatment, and thus we're starting from a Basemesh, which you can get for free on my Gumroad. Setting up some nice face sets, which I found there's two ways to do, either using the face set brush in sculpt mode or making a selection in edit mode. Some proper UVs, it's very nice to have them set up before starting. And I'm using PureRef for reference. It's mostly images captured from the last couple of Blender conferences, because they're the most up to date. Now, this is my first time sculpting in Blender, and I expected it to be kind of a frustrating experience, simply because I'm really not used to it. But I gotta say, I was actually pleasantly surprised. I really didn't expect to be able to get into it so quickly. I was slower than usual at first, but it was very easy to get used to. I mean, within a day, it felt completely natural. Now, obviously a lot of the core tools are the same as in ZBrush, but there's subtle differences in the interface which I thought would take me longer to get used to and might be slower. But they really aren't, so it's a really well set up sculpting interface. This Basemesh we're using, by the way, is also made in Blender, so this will still be 100% modeled in Blender. And again, feel free to get it on Gumroad for free, face sets and UVs and all. Now, it took me a while to realize that this isn't ZBrush, so I could jump into material view and look at my model with a nice material and lighting setup, which is something I couldn't do before. And it feels fantastic. It actually even took some getting used to, because I'm not used to my model looking this good while I'm sculpting on it. And around this point, I decided to start working on that smile. So I also added the interior of the mouth, which is an old asset which I've made years ago, although I did also rework it somewhat for this project. So here we are in the second subdiv level using the multi-res modifier, which is really nice, works pretty much exactly the same as ZBrush's subdiv levels. It's honestly amazing to me how fully fledged this feature set is in Blender as well, considering how well it can do everything else as well. It isn't flawless, but none of the software is. And I'll talk about some quirks I ran into later on. I don't know how many developers there are on their team, but I don't think there are that many. And this is really impressive. And they're all amazing for what they're doing, but to think that for so long the driving force behind this incredible free piece of software has been the hard work, the dedication, and the difficult decisions made by just one person. That's just monumental. I highly recommend you watch Blender Guru's interview with Roosendaal from 2018, in case you haven't already. He talks a lot about the entire history of Blender, which I found fascinating. Anyway, I realized I needed to give my model a pair of glasses before I could really see the likeness a little bit better. And yes, the mouth needs to go way up. I'll get to that. But for some reason I first decided to refine the teeth a little bit. You can see this mouth interior model is pretty detailed. I'll put this up on my Gumroad as well. You know, because it's teeth and gums. So around this stage I decided I should finally find out how to line up some reference images with my model. Turns out it's pretty easy. You just set up a camera and then go into background images over there on the right, and then choose your image and set opacity. And then just mess around with it for a little while until you get the perspective to match somewhat. And there we go, finally moving that mouth a little bit upwards. And obviously the chin needed to move up a little bit as well. I know this is an old photo, so I am using it just for proportions and the expression. And it's just the only really detailed portrait photo I could find, and he has a really nice smile in this photo. Not much to say about what I'm doing right now really, just looking at my reference images and slowly getting there. This will definitely be the last really long video like this that I'm making for a while at least. I really wasn't planning on making something as big as this again, because it takes really long to record and then to edit. But when I started looking into Blender's sculpting features and realized, hey, this is actually pretty good, I decided I should do something just to see how far I can push it in a production-like workflow. Pretty far as it turns out. And who better to be my first sculpt than the man we have to thank for all of this? It's also why I decided I should really do my best to do him justice. So I definitely took my sweet time with this one. I kept coming back to it and fixing things I didn't like. But it's also excellent practice to persevere with a project like this every once in a while to improve your skills. So I'm very happy I did it, even though so far I haven't fulfilled my other goal of being more active on this channel. Now, this is obviously sped up. It's sped up by 500%. I've also cut out a lot of recording time, just for the sake of this not being 4 hours long. But I did want to show the whole thing being sculpted in Blender. The only other software I used for this was Substance Painter for texturing. Hopefully you can still see exactly what I'm doing. It's a nice thing that you can see the entire interface the whole time. And I'm still using just the most basic brushes. Only occasionally using those face sets we made in the beginning to hide and show some parts of the head. It's super rare that I'd be making a facial expression. Usually it's just completely neutral and then riggers and animators would take care of animating it. So I'm trying to be very careful to get it right. Now this hair I know doesn't look great. It's only a proxy which I made for preview purposes just to help me get a better likeness. It was very quick to make thanks to Blender's new very intuitive hair system. But I'm not showing how I did this one because I'll be doing it properly at the end. And honestly I don't think it's that interesting to see. Because the workflow is pretty simple, it just takes a while to do. So here I'm starting to sketch out where the big wrinkles are gonna go. This is obviously not a high enough subdivision to hold this sort of detail, but it'll serve as a guide for where I need to refine when I subdivide it again. And I am using this old photo again, which is I think more than a decade old. But the detail and the lighting on it is so good, you can tell exactly where the wrinkles are. And the major wrinkles don't really change with age. So this is still fantastic reference. And yeah, you can see there's no hair at the back because, like I said, I only made this as a preview. Now, you can see one issue I ran into, which is this glitching color while I'm in sculpt mode. But before I talk more about that, here's a piece of advice. Don't ever edit your geometry in edit mode while you have a multi-res modifier on your model, because then that geometry just goes insane. Even with the multi-res eraser brush I couldn't fix it because it messed it up again as soon as you went out of sculpt mode. In the end I fixed it by applying the modifier, and then after the geometry is fixed, adding a new multi-res modifier and rebuilding subdivisions. But at least it got me to pay a little more attention to the eyes and refine them a little bit more. Also, here's a nice piece of general knowledge. The human eyeball is about 2.4 centimeters in diameter and the iris itself is about 1, and it's always a good idea to work in the correct scale. Okay, so remember that glitching color we saw earlier? It's an issue I find very unfortunate considering how well everything else works. And I've mentioned before that I really like having color information whenever I'm sculpting a model because it can be super helpful. But apparently when you're working on a mesh which has a multi-res modifier on it and you're in sculpt mode, you can't have a texture or vertex paint. And this is a shame because Blender has these fantastic viewport rendering capabilities, which is a huge advantage, so I hate seeing it undermined like this by a technical limitation. And apparently it is a technical limitation and not a bug. They've been aware of it for a long time. It has to do with the rendering algorithm used for sculpt mode, and apparently it's a lot of work to add texture and vertex paint support. I guess the dev team doesn't consider this to be terribly important, but for me as a character artist, I'd say this is pretty essential. I saw that a lot of people have been reporting on this issue, so I know I'm not the only one. This was the only serious limitation I found though. One other less important one and easy to fix is that whenever you have hair on a mesh with multi-res and you enter sculpt mode, the hair will snap to where it was before the multi-res displacement and then snap back to where it should be when you go out of sculpt mode. But this is tiny, all you gotta do is occasionally apply the modifier and then add a new one. In any case, working on the wrinkles as I am right now, I prefer to stick to a clay material so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Otherwise, once the skin material is applied, it's very hard to see. All these wrinkles may look way too deep right now, but you'll see what I mean when we add a skin material. Right now we're at 4 million polygons at the 5th subdivision level, and it's still perfectly responsive, I gotta say. I didn't expect it to handle this well. And this is usually absolutely high enough for one mesh for most types of projects. But for this one I wanted to go above and beyond that, as high as I could push it. I'm taking extra care in getting the finer details right, because like I mentioned, it's very important to me that this portrait does justice to Blender's creator as well as to Blender itself, just to see for myself and for anybody watching this what kind of results I can achieve with Blender. And at this stage I'm still not even using any custom brushes or anything. I have a bunch of add-ons installed which I use in my poly modeling workflow, but so far I don't think I've used any of them on this project. So this is still just a stock Blender experience. I love that they've added this mudbox clay material, which I really prefer to ZBrush's default materials. I have a custom one like this in ZBrush as well, but you don't get it by default like you do here. And again, it's super nice that you can switch back and forth between clay shading and realistic shading. I'm taking my sweet time working on all these wrinkles, and like I said, I'm not focusing on the educational aspect of this video, but I am still taking the time in editing and showing the entire process. So I hope you can appreciate all the extra work I put in and still get something from it as well. And I think most of what I'm doing should be pretty self-explanatory. And if you do have any questions, feel free to comment below and I'll reply. Anyway, I'm slowly starting to test it in cycles now, because the next stage is the finer detailing and I need to see how it's going to look in the final shading. And here's how you need to set up your brush for applying alpha stamps. Firstly, we set the mapping to area plane, the stroke method to anchored, and the sample bias is so you don't displace the whole thing up or down, but only add surface detail. It may need some adjustment, and in my case 5 centimeters worked really well. And here's where I finally needed to get an extra add-on. I knew I wanted to work in sculpt layers because for this stage especially it saves you a ton of headaches. But I found that Blender doesn't have this feature by default. The great thing about Blender though is that if you ever need to do something and it doesn't have it as a feature, there usually already is an add-on for that. And this was no exception, thankfully. So I found this add-on which is called Sculpt Layers, oddly enough. And it works really well. Albeit a bit slow for this kind of mesh, which is relatively high. One thing you gotta remember with this add-on is to always save your changes to the layer you're working on, which you gotta do manually, unlike in ZBrush. But after I got used to this, I found that I actually really like it, because what this means is that you can decide which layer you wanna save your changes to after you've worked on the model. Or you can save to the base model and not the layers, which is something you cannot do in ZBrush, but is quite useful. So no more sculpting fine wrinkles for 30 minutes and then realizing you were sculpting into the layer meant for general proportions the whole time. It's also pretty easy to paint out and redo anything from a specific layer, which I needed to do several times on this model. And you can see the first one I made was a layer for overall bumpiness. And this is kind of hard to tell in realistic lighting and material setups, but if you look at a 3D scan, the skin has a lot of bumpiness to it. And to complement that, I added another layer for noise. And then I finally used some alpha stamps for the really fine details. And you can see in the realistic shading, you can barely tell it's there. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that these kind of need to be deeper than you may expect when looking at it with the clay material. And for this detail, I am using a paid alpha stamp set which I got from Texturing XYZ. I would highly recommend it if you ever want to manually sculpt pore detail on a face like this. It comes with separate stamps for each part of the face, along with a map that shows you which one goes where. So they've prepared it in a very user-friendly way. And the rest of the time I'm using the alphas from that free brush set by Rafa Souza, which I was talking about in the Seth Everman video. And I know it's hidden behind the reference image on the top left, but right now we're at 16 million polygons and it's still handling pretty well. A bit laggy whenever you need to undo anything, but it's still totally workable. This stage is a lot of fun. I was very happy when I found that I could do this at 16mm. This is well past the usual production quality level of detail that a client might want. And you can see how using the correct alpha stamp for each facial feature makes it a lot more believable. Like the wrinkling and the direction in the eyelids especially, and the cheeks and the forehead. I'm happy I got that set from Texturing XYZ. I don't even have an affiliate link or anything. It's just very good. And right now I'm using the free stamps as well to complement the other ones. Taking a while on this stage as well, but I am showing the whole thing. I don't want any non-believers saying I did any of this in ZBrush. Now I'll just gradually be adding some more refinements, some more pores, some more bumpiness here and there. There really isn't that much else to say about this stage. So let's go on a little tangent about Blender's place in the CG world. Now, in one of the recent Blender Heads videos, Ton himself expressed some mild concern about managing to keep Blender relevant in the future. And the way I see it, Blender is always going to be relevant. I for one am regularly blown away by the stuff that even singular artists make for things like Clint Jones's challenges entirely in Blender. There's really nothing else like it. There's no other software that can basically do most if not all parts of a CG pipeline, and to such a good level, free of charge. And with basically all of the other software now jacking up their prices and going subscription only, this will most definitely keep Blender as the only option for many studios, as well as many educational establishments, not to mention freelance artists. And with how rapidly it's been improving and gaining popularity among young artists, I think it's a real possibility that they can take over some parts of production as industry standard in some time, if they can maintain that momentum. But that would be quite hard to achieve. They're working on a lot of things at the same time, whereas most other software specializes in just one thing. And it's one thing that they've gathered a lot of expertise in over the years. So yeah, this is just my very speculative opinion on the matter. For me, as a professional game dev character artist, I already use Blender every day in tandem with ZBrush and Substance because I find that these are the best tools for my needs. And if you started out with Blender and then needed to switch to some paid software at some point later on, that's not hard once you already know the ins and outs of how computer graphics are generally made. It's really all the same, just in a different package. Some tools may be more efficient for you than others, but they really do the same thing. So here we are almost at the end of the detailing stage. And from here on I knew I couldn't do anything else to the model at such a high density, so it's time to bake all of the detail down to a more reasonable subdivision level. Luckily this mesh already has UVs, so there's no need to do anything else other than to export it. Baking and texturing is the only thing I didn't use Blender for on this project, even though Blender can do that too pretty well. It just would have been another thing to relearn how to do in Blender rather than what I'm used to. And here the process is exactly the same as in my previous video, but I am briefly going over it again. We have this base layer and then the red layer with a noisy mask, which we can just then paint over to show where we want it to show. My go-to brushes for this, you can see on the top left, are the Dirt 1 and the Smooth Noisy. And one thing I found out only recently is that you can right click on a brush and add it to favorites so it shows up at the top of the brush list. It's a super useful feature. I felt pretty dumb not having known about it for a really long time. Anyway, this is pretty much it for the red. The next one is blue. Only using a different noise texture and then very subtle painting because I obviously don't want it to be as prominent as the red one. And the next one is this greenish yellow, which is still pretty subtle, but you can see how it complements the red in a pretty satisfying way. And then green, which is again pretty subtle. You can see how dark the mask is. Purple, same thing. I like to use it around the eyelids. And at the end I like to add some subtle ambient occlusion and cavity detail. And this is the roughness map, which is just a cavity map with just a little bit of painting on top. Now there's a couple of additional things I did on this one. First one is this layer for darker clogged up pores which we get around the nose. I used the curvature map to get the initial masking of the bumps and then did some extra painting on top. Now you can see the UV damage layer, which is one of my usual ones, which starts out as a nice splotchy noise texture which I just paint over like all the other layers. And then this one here is a height layer which I'm using to either accentuate some of the wrinkles and add some new ones, or to mask out and smooth out some bumps or wrinkles I don't like as much. This is a great trick for doing final tweaks to wrinkles and finer pore detail. It saves you the hassle of doing extra sculpting and then re-exporting and then rebaking, and you have immediate visual feedback. So I think it's fantastic that it's so easy to do this in Substance. And for this sort of detail I use the basic brush with the Thorn Alpha. It makes it nice and sharp like the Damien Standard in ZBrush or the Draw Sharp in Blender. And by the way, this normal map detail was baked at 8K, but we're only seeing 4K here in Substance Painter because that's as high as it'll let you have your scene. So I'm very happy with the amount of detail we got out of that 16 million mesh. And here it is all imported back into Blender. It's nice and light now at less than 15,000 faces, so it'll be a very good base to start making the hair. And for the hair I'm using the same workflow as before. Starting out with a few base strands, and then after some combing work I'd add all the rest using the density brush. And then usually a frizz or noise modifier, just to make it a little bit messier and natural looking. I also like using the select random function, and then I manually comb them to add some more variation with some more control. And yeah, on this one I didn't mirror the eyebrows. I wanted them to be more unique compared to each other. I did the same thing for the facial hair. You saw the base strands I used, and then the density brush and the frizz modifiers. I've said this before, but I love how fast and intuitive this new hair system is. In order to keep things more organized, I decided to make separate hair systems for many different parts of the face and the head. The modifiers have all slightly different parameters for each part, and of course it gives me the added benefit of being able to work on something without accidentally affecting something else. And right now it's using principled BSDF shaders because I'm working on it in Eevee, but I will be switching to the principled hair shader when I'm rendering it in cycles at the end. And here you can see I'm adding another hair system on top of the existing one for the beard. This is for the darker hairs. Once again, I wanted to place them manually for more precision. And that's what I did for all of the hair systems. I'm not showing the whole process for all 29 of them, because even with these intuitive controls, it took a while. And this is obviously now rendering in cycles as well, with proper materials. And here's how I duplicated the eyebrows and moved the hairs around a bit to add color variation. And now this is getting pretty close to what I want. But there's still a few details I wanted to add. First one is these transition hairs. They're just these short, thin, wispy hairs which go along the edges of the regular hair growth. You can see again this is a subtle effect, but it adds a lot of believability and it's worth the extra effort in my opinion. And the other one is the so-called peach fuzz, which are these really short, really thin hairs that we have growing out of our skin. I knew there were going to be a huge number of these, and they're very, very short anyway, so I set the hair segments to a lower number, and it was still pretty heavy. But again, totally worth it. I did also paint a very simple mask so they don't grow out of areas like the eyelids and the lips. Now, I was wondering what kind of garment to put on him. A t-shirt would have been the easiest, and I have plenty of reference images of him in a t-shirt. But I like how he looks in a dress shirt, so I decided to go the extra mile and model a shirt. No simulation this time. I wanted to make it all in Blender. Also, my Marvelous Designer subscription ran out. So I did it all the old-fashioned way. Started out with a Basemesh out of polygons. I made sure I had good topology so that I could correctly separate the parts of the shirt and also unwrap the UVs for each one correctly. Proper straight UVs are pretty important for fabrics. Probably not so much for a finer fabric like this, but it's generally very good practice. And here's how I separated the pieces of the shirt, which was super easy thanks to the nice topology. And now using vertex crease and edge crease to, well, crease the collar in the correct shape. So after that was all set up, I started sculpting. I didn't want the shirt to be too wrinkly, just sitting nice and natural. And because it's only going to be viewed from the front, I didn't really work on the back at all. And I'm still only using the basic brushes we get with Blender. This here is a nice trick where you mask out part of the garment so you can sculpt a nice sharp wrinkle. And I do want it to be detailed, but not insanely detailed, because obviously this isn't the focus of this project. And this is my first time sculpting clothing in Blender as well. And after it handling the head so well, I knew I wasn't going to have any problems with this shirt. And once again, I love that I have the possibility here of going into edit mode and working on the vertices of my base mesh rather than sculpting all the time. Sometimes that can be super useful, like just now on the middle section of the shirt. Not doing all this in Marvelous Designer is actually pretty good in this case, especially for something like this where I want it to look in a certain way. It probably would have been a much bigger hassle to get something I liked. If this were like a full character in a rigging pose, it's nice to have those natural looking garments with like neutral wrinkles, at least as a starting point. A lot of the time I'd sculpt over and completely change big parts of it anyway. So maybe it is a little bit more work, but at least I'm getting exactly the result I want. And now I'm just adding some micro wrinkles again using alpha stamps. And the UV coordinates were a breeze to set up because of the nice topology we started out with in the beginning. So it's all mapped nice and straight as it should be. This is what the final sculpt looked like, and at the end I just added some stitching in Substance Painter. Then I worked on finalizing the glasses, which was pretty simple modeling stuff, so I'm going through it very quickly. Again, making good use of vertex and edge creasing. And at the end I made whatever the hell this thing is called. I did also make the glass part of the glasses, of course. I just kept it hidden most of the time because it got in the way. And it also renders much more slowly in the viewport, because the refraction is just a slower calculation. And this was pretty much it for this project. It was a heck of an experience for me, and I hope you enjoyed my retelling of it. And I do hope it was still also useful to watch. I'm happy with the end result, but I'd love to know what you think. I'm still pretty new at this YouTube thing, so if you did enjoy this, please like and subscribe so I can get this channel off the ground and bring you more, hopefully useful stuff in the future. So this is all for now, and I'll see you in the next one.